In this video, we'll discuss one of the core concepts of UiPath or any programming language, which is loops. In one of the previous videos, we saw how to print the elements of an array using their index numbers, but there was a very small array with just 3 elements. Imagine if you have like 100 or 1,000 elements, it is not practical to print them all using the index numbers. Also, there will be other complex scenarios. For example, you may not know how many elements exist in an array, or let's say you may want to access only every alternate element instead of all the elements. So in order to handle these complex scenarios, UiPath provides 3 types of loop activities: for each, while, and do while. Let's take a look at them one by one. I have created a new project called loops, and I have added a sequence called sequence master. I have also created a string array variable called names and have added 12 names in the default value. Now let's create a for each loop and write each of these names in the output window. You can find all the 3 loop activities under workflow, control. So I'll drag and drop the for each activity here. Now this activity will execute a list of steps within this body sequence for each item in a given collection. This could be an array like what we have here, but it could also be other collection types such as data tables, lists, and so on. So I'll type names here, and inside the body, I'll add a writeLine activity. Now we want to print each name, which is basically this item variable. So I'll type item here, and you can see a warning which says option strict on disallows implicit conversion from object to string. This is because the item variable in a for each loop by default is represented as an object. So we can change that by clicking on this for each activity. And on the properties tab, you can see the type argument is set to object. So I just change it to string and the warning is gone. Now you might be wondering why I keep calling this item as a variable, but we don't see it in the variables tab here. Well, this is a special type of variable called an iterator variable, and it is declared during the execution of this for each loop, and because of that it is valid only within this body. So that is why you don't have to create it here. In other words, you don't have to declare it explicitly. In fact, I can call it anything. It doesn't have to be item. You can be more specific. For example, I can change this to name, and it'll work without any issues. And now it reads for each name in names. That makes more sense than saying for each item in names. Now it should automatically get updated in this writeLine activity as well. In fact, all the activities within this body. But in case if you don't see that, just collapse this body and expand it, and you should see it updated. This is what I love about UiPath. It just makes your life so easy. Alright, now let's run the process. And here you go, it printed all the 12 names. Now let's say if I want to print only the names that start with the letter J. So I'll add an if activity and type the condition name.starts_with, and I'll pass the letter J as an argument. I'll then move this writeLine activity inside the then block and leave the else block as it is because we don't want to do anything if the name doesn't start with the letter J. Now let's run the process. And you can see that it printed only the 3 names starting with J. Now let's do the same using the while loop. But before that, I'll collapse this for each loop and disable it. I'll then add the while loop. The while loop has just 2 parts, a condition and a body, which is basically a sequence, and it'll execute the sequence as long as the condition is true. For example, let's say I type a condition 9 lesser than 10, which is indeed true, and I'll add a writeLine activity and say hello there. Now if I run the process, it'll first check this condition and see it is true, so it'll execute this sequence, and then it'll again check the condition and it'll still be true, so it'll again execute the same sequence, and this will go on and on in an infinite loop. So let's see that in action. As you can see, it keeps writing hello there, and you can see the line count increasing here. Now, the only way to stop this is to click this stop button, and it stopped. Now, let's create a variable called counter, and I'll set the variable type as int32 and the default value to 0. Now, instead of the condition 9 less than 10, I'll type counter less than 10. And below this write line activity, I'll add an assign activity and say counter equals counter plus 1. So basically, we are increasing this counter variable by 1. Now when I run this process, it will first check if the counter is less than 10, and yes, it will be less than 10 because the default value for counter is 0. So it will execute the write line activity first, and then it will execute the assign activity where the value of counter will be increased by 1. And then it will check the condition again. It is still true, so it will execute the sequence and the counter value will now be 2. And this will repeat until the value of counter becomes 10. Once it becomes 10, the condition will fail because both the left hand and the right hand values will be equal. So at this point, the loop will stop and it will not proceed any further, and that will be the end of this. So let's run the process and see that in action. There you go, it stopped by itself, and if I expand this output window a little bit, you can see it has written hello there 10 times because we started the counter from 0. If we had started the counter from 1, it would have executed only 9 times. Now let's see how to apply this method to print all the names in the array. We still need the counter, so let's leave it there, but we don't want the loop to execute a fixed number of times like 10 here. Instead, we want to execute it as many times as the number of elements in this array. So we will delete this 10 and type names.length. And here, instead of hello there, we want to print the names inside the array. We already know that you can access the elements using the index number. So if I type names of counter, it'll take the value of counter for each iteration in the loop. For the first iteration, the value of counter will be 0, so it'll write John. And in the next iteration, it'll be 1, so it'll write Arun. And it'll go on until it reaches 11, which is the index for the last element in the array. Alright, so let's run this process. Here you go, it printed all the 12 names. Finally, let's take a look at the do while loop. So I'll collapse this and disable it. I'll add a do while loop. The do while loop is almost the same as while loop. The only difference is that in the while loop, it will first check the condition and then execute the statement. But in the do while loop, it'll execute the statement first and then it'll check for the condition. So let's see how this works. I'll leave the counter as it is and add a write line activity. Then add an assign activity. Counter equals counter plus 1. And the same condition, counter less than names.length. And if I run the process, it printed all the 12 names. So what is the difference between do while and while? You typically use a do while loop in scenarios where you want the bot to execute a statement at least once before it checks for a condition. We will be using all these 3 loops in different scenarios throughout our course. There are some scenarios where one loop is preferred over the other. For example, let's say you don't know if this array will always have some value or sometimes may be empty. In those scenarios, it is always better to use the while loop. Let's say if the array is empty and you use a do while loop, it will fail at the first iteration itself because the array has no values in it. Alright, so I hope you got a very good understanding of the 3 loops. Now it's time for a challenge. For this exercise, you need to create a game where UiPath will generate a random number between 1 and 10 and will ask you to guess that number. If you guess the correct number, it should say you guessed it right, and the game will end. If you guess a wrong number, it should say try a bigger number or try a smaller number depending on what you guessed, and this should go in a loop until you guess the right number. In order to generate a random number, you can use the random.next method. And here is the syntax for that method. The 1 and 10 inside the parentheses are the lower and upper limit of the random number to be generated. Alright, so try this exercise with both while and do while loops, and we will review the solution in the next video.